The microphone that picks up the couch area on The Tonight Show in 1972 runs through a small junction box that sits just behind the set wall, about 8 feet from where the guests sit. My job that season was to monitor that junction box during tapings and make adjustments if the signal drifted, which meant I was 8 feet from the couch. On the night Steven Seagal told Bruce Lee he couldn't fight, he just acted. I heard every word. I heard the words that went out on air, and I heard the words during the commercial breaks that didn't. I watched what happened after the segment through a door I was not supposed to be watching through. I am 85 years old. My name is George Malley. I have kept the complete version of this inside me for 50 years. This is the complete version.
The Tonight Show in 1972 ran the way it always ran, with the organized efficiency of something that had been doing the same thing 5 nights a week for 10 years. From inside the production, the show felt like a machine that had been refined into something close to frictionless. Everybody knowing their part, the whole thing moving from monologue to first segment to second segment to close with the practiced ease of repetition. My part was the audio monitoring station behind the set wall, which put me in a position that was functionally invisible to the guests and the audience while being functionally present for everything that happened on the couch. I had been in that position for 2.5 years when the Thursday in question happened. I had heard a great many things through the audio feed from that junction box that never went out on air. Most of them were minor. The underbreath comments of guests during breaks, the brief exchanges between Johnny and the segment producer during transitions, the occasional thing said between guests that was meant for each other, rather than for the room. You hear all of it from 8 feet away, behind a thin set wall, and you develop a specific relationship with information that is yours because of your position, rather than your right to it. You learn to hold it appropriately. The guest for the first segment that night was Steven Seagal. He was 20 years old. He had been training in Aikido for 6 years, had spent time in Japan studying with serious teachers, and had come back to the United States with a genuine technical foundation and a specific relationship to his own ability that I would come to understand better over the course of the evening. He was tall, physically imposing in the way that height and trained muscle combine in a young person who has been building both since their teens. And he carried himself with the specific ease of someone who has spent years being told that what they can do is impressive and has integrated that information into their baseline understanding of themselves. He had been on the show twice before for shorter appearances, and Fred de Cordova had been building to a longer segment with him for months. The booking that night was a full conversation about Aikido, about what it was, and what it produced, and what it meant as a discipline, with a brief demonstration included. Clean, interesting television. Fred had done segments like it before and knew how to make them work. What Fred had also arranged, and what Seagal did not know until the show started, was the second guest. Bruce Lee, arriving as a surprise second guest, was something that had become almost a format by this point in 1972. He had a condition that the booking team had come to understand as non-negotiable: no advance announcement, no pre-show promotion, surprise, or nothing. He said it made better television. Everyone who had experienced the results agreed with him. He arrived at the studio through the side entrance at about 5:30. I was not in my monitoring position yet. I was still in the audio prep area down the hall, and I saw him come in through the corridor. He moved through the building the way he always moved, with the quality of complete presence that I had heard described by people who had seen him in person and that I had not fully understood from the descriptions until I saw it myself. He went to his green room, and I went back to my setup, and by 7:30, I was in position behind the set wall. Seagal had done his preparation in the opposite green room. I had walked past it twice during setup, and both times he had been doing the specific focused warm-up of someone who takes their physical preparation seriously, moving through slow, deliberate Aikido movements in the small space, the preparation of a person who expects to perform and wants to be ready to perform well. He was good on camera when the segment started. I had heard him on the previous shorter appearances, and he had been good then too, but this was better, the more comfortable version of him that more time in front of cameras produces. He talked about Aikido with the specific enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believes in what they're describing and has the knowledge to describe it well. He demonstrated one technique with a willing stagehand, and the technique was clean and controlled, and the audience responded well. He was making the kind of impression the booking was designed to make, and then Johnny looked at the camera with the expression I had learned to recognize through the set wall, the expression that he telegraphed about 3 seconds before he did something that was going to change the temperature of the segment. He said, "You know, speaking of martial arts and what they can produce, I have a second guest tonight who I think has some thoughts on that, a man who I know the audience is very excited to see. Ladies and gentlemen, Bruce Lee." The curtain opened. From behind the set wall I can hear the audience, but I can't see them from my monitoring position. What I can hear tells me a great deal. The sound that went through the studio when Bruce Lee walked through that curtain was a wave sound, the specific sound of recognition moving through 400 people at different speeds as different people caught up to the same information. By the time the wave completed its travel through the room, it had the quality of genuine and unreserved enthusiasm. I heard Bruce come to the desk and shake Johnny's hand. I heard him move toward the couch. And then I heard what Seagal did. He said, "Hey, good to meet you." He said it pleasantly. He said it in the tone of a man who has just been introduced to someone and is performing the social grace of the introduction without particularly meaning it. Not hostile, not cold. The tone of someone for whom the meeting is not significant, which was itself a statement. In a studio where 400 people had just made the sound they made when Bruce Lee walked in, a 20-year-old saying, "Hey, good to meet you," in the tone of a routine social introduction, was its own kind of thing. The people close enough to hear it noticed. I noticed. From 8 feet away, through a set wall, I noticed. Bruce said something back. Warm, brief. He sat down. Johnny steered into the obvious territory, the conversation between two martial arts practitioners about their respective disciplines. He asked Bruce about Jeet Kune Do, about what it was, and how it had developed. He asked Seagal what he made of a philosophy that emphasized drawing from multiple styles rather than committing to one. Seagal said, "I think there's real value in deep commitment to a single system. Aikido is a complete discipline, with roots going back hundreds of years. What I've found in 6 years of serious study is that the depth available within a single serious tradition is essentially unlimited. The appeal of drawing from multiple styles is understandable, but I think it can sometimes be a way of avoiding the real work of mastering one thing." Bruce said, "That's a legitimate point about depth. I'd say the question is what the mastery is for. If the goal is to master the art as a tradition, then depth within a single system is the right path. If the goal is to understand what works in real situations, a broader foundation has advantages." Seagal said, "It depends on what you mean by real situations." He said it with the tone of someone who has a specific thing they mean by real situations and suspects the other person means something different. Bruce said, "What do you mean by it?" Seagal said, "I mean situations where someone is actually trying to hurt you, not controlled training environments, not film sets, real situations." The reference to film sets was the first edge. The audience registered it with the specific murmuring of people who have heard something that contains something underneath its surface. Johnny said, "I think both of your work involves real preparation and real skill, Bruce. You've spoken about how the film work comes out of genuine training." Seagal said, "I have a lot of respect for what Bruce has built as a career. The films are genuinely impressive entertainment, but I think there's an honest distinction between what a martial arts film represents and what a martial arts discipline represents, and I think the audience deserves to hear someone say that." He said it pleasantly. He said it with the tone of someone making a reasonable observation about categorization, and underneath the reasonable tone was the edge, the specific edge, of someone who has found a way to say what they actually mean while maintaining the surface of saying something fair. Bruce said, "You're right that there's a distinction. The film work and the training are different things. What the film work represents about the training is a separate question." Seagal said, "What does it represent, in your view?" Bruce said, "A fraction of it. The part that translates to a camera. The training itself has nothing to do with cameras." Seagal said, "How would I know that?" Bruce said, "You wouldn't. From where you're sitting." Seagal said, "Exactly." He said it with the quality of someone who has just had their point made for them. The room had gone to the attentive quiet of an audience that is following something that has more underneath it than its surface suggests. Johnny was watching both of them with the expression he wore when he was deciding whether to redirect or let something develop. He let it develop. He asked the question directly. He said, "All right, who's better? I know that's a broad question and probably unfair, but you're both on my couch, and I'm curious. If I had to put my money on one of you in a real situation, who is it?" He said it lightly, as a joke. The kind of question hosts ask to generate a playful exchange that gives the audience something to respond to without creating actual conflict. Seagal responded to it as a real question. He said, "I think you genuinely can't compare a working martial artist with a Hollywood actor who has incorporated martial arts into his image. Those are different categories, and treating them as comparable is what creates the confusion in the public understanding of what martial arts actually is." He said Hollywood actor with a specific quality of a phrase, chosen to define rather than describe, to place something in a category rather than acknowledge what it is. The room was not murmuring anymore. The room was quiet. If you think that line was the sharpest thing said in the first segment, what he said after the first commercial break will change your mind entirely. Bruce said, "Very even. Before the first film, I had been training every day for 15 years. I had built a school. I had students who were competing and winning at the professional level across multiple disciplines. The films came after all of that. Actor is accurate as a description of part of what I do. It's not accurate as a description of what I am. Seagal said, I understand that's the story. He said it with the quality of someone drawing a distinction between what someone says and what is true. The quiet devastation of I understand, that's the story, delivered pleasantly, in the same tone that someone might say, I understand that's how you see it. Bruce looked at him, the complete attention he gave to things that required complete attention. He said, what do you think the story is? Seagal said, I think the story is that you're the most famous martial arts actor in the world, which is a genuine achievement. I think the question of whether what produced the fame and what produces martial arts ability are the same thing is worth examining. Bruce said, and your examination concludes. Seagal said, my examination concludes that you can't fight. You act. And you act very, very well. But those are different skills. The room made the sound rooms make when something has been said that is direct enough and specific enough and delivered with enough pleasant certainty that 400 people simultaneously process it as real rather than as rhetoric. You can't fight. You act. Said at normal conversational volume by a 20-year-old Aikido practitioner to the most recognizable martial artist in the world, on live television, in front of 400 people and however many millions watching at home. Johnny said, well, he said it the way he said things when things had arrived somewhere he hadn't planned for them to arrive, and he needed a moment to find the frame. He said, I think that's a bold statement that probably warrants some discussion. Bruce said, and his voice had a quality it hadn't had before in the segment, not louder, not angrier, quieter actually, the specific lower register of someone who has found the version of themselves that does not perform anything in a tense situation. Let's discuss it then. Seagal said, I'm happy to discuss it. Bruce said, what evidence would change your view? Seagal said, I'm not sure there's evidence available to me from this couch. Bruce said, there might be. The room understood what he meant before he said anything more specific. 400 people, and one production crew, and one audio monitoring technician behind the set wall, all understanding what he meant before he said anything more specific. Johnny called commercial breaks so fast, I heard it from behind the set wall as a compressed version of his professional voice, the clipped urgency of a host who has been doing this for 10 years and knows exactly when to pull a rope. The on-air light dropped. From 8 feet away, through the set wall, I could hear what happened during the commercial break more clearly than I could hear most things. Fred de Cordova was on the floor fast. I heard his footsteps before I heard his voice, the specific pace of a producer who has made a decision and is executing it. He went to Johnny first, the brief exchange between them that accomplished in 10 words what would take most people a paragraph. Then he went to the couch. He said something to Seagal about the professional context and the responsibility that came with a platform like this, and the importance of keeping things at the level of conversation rather than allowing them to move somewhere else. Seagal said he understood. I did not believe from the tone that he understood. Fred said something to Bruce. I caught the shape of it. Something about appreciating Bruce's patience and the show's commitment to real conversation and the value of what had already developed. Bruce said, I'm not going to pretend to be less certain than I am about what I know to make the segment easier. Fred said something back. Bruce said, that's not what I'm saying. The on-air light came back on. Johnny opened the second portion of the segment with the specific professional warmth of a host who has been in this business long enough to treat a commercial break as a reset and a reset as an opportunity. He asked Bruce something about the philosophy of Jeet Kune Do, the kind of question designed to move toward territory that was interesting without being inflammatory. Seagal let the answer run. Then he said, I want to come back to something. Johnny said, of course. Seagal said, Bruce talked about his training and his students and the 15 years before the films. I'm not disputing any of that. What I'm saying is that training and competing and teaching are different from testing. And I think the public perception of Bruce Lee as a fighter, as an actual martial artist who could function in a real confrontation, is based primarily on what they've seen on screen, rather than on any documented test of those capabilities in an appropriate context. He said it reasonably. That was the thing about how he said it, the consistent reasonableness of his delivery, the way a reasonable tone makes an unreasonable claim harder to challenge, without seeming like you're challenging the tone rather than the claim. Bruce said, and what would you consider an appropriate context? Seagal said, I'd consider any context where the outcome wasn't prearranged to be appropriate. He said, prearranged, and let the word do the work it was designed to do. Bruce said, you're suggesting my outcomes on screen are representative of my outcomes in life. Seagal said, I'm suggesting they're the only evidence available to most people. Bruce said, I'll tell you what, Let's generate some different evidence. The room made the sound it made. Seagal said, right here. Bruce said, wherever you want. Johnny said, what I want is for both of you to stay on this couch and keep this as a conversation, because that's what a television show is. It's a conversation. And Bruce said, I agree with you, Johnny. He said it simply, not as a concession, as an actual agreement. He said, a television couch is not the place to answer this question. I agree. The question is whether Stephen wants it answered elsewhere. Seagal said, I'd like it answered. Johnny said, with the specific voice of a man calling on every professional resource available to him. We are going to take another break, and when we come back, I would like very much for this to be a different kind of conversation. The on-air light dropped again. This break was longer than the first one. I heard Fred on the floor again, this time with what sounded like two other people, the specific ambient quality of several professionals managing the same situation from different angles. I heard a security person's radio at some point, the brief burst of communication that event security uses when they're being updated on a situation. I heard Fred say, at one point, clearly enough to leave no ambiguity about the content, both of you need to go backstage right now, or both of you need to leave the building. Those are the options that are available. I heard Seagal say something in return. I heard Bruce say, backstage is fine. The on-air light did not come back on. The audience was told something. I don't know what exactly. I was not in a position to hear the floor announcement. What I heard was the ambient quality of 400 people receiving information about a change of plans and processing it. What I did next is the thing I have been least certain about how to describe for 50 years, because it was not my place to do it, and I did so anyway, and the only honest account of it acknowledges both of those things. I left my monitoring position. The junction box didn't need me while the show wasn't running, and the show wasn't running, and the backstage corridor that connected the main production area to the secondary staging rooms ran directly behind the position I was already in. I had used it to move equipment on dozens of occasions. I knew where it went, and I knew which door opened onto which space. I went through the door at the end of the corridor. The secondary staging area was a medium-sized room used for pre-show equipment storage and occasional secondary prep work, rubber-floored, high-ceilinged, fluorescent lit. I had set up in it before. I knew it. I came through the door and positioned myself near a stack of road cases along the far wall, close enough to the center of the room to see what was happening, far enough from the center of the room to be in shadow rather than in direct light. Bruce was in the center of the room. Seagal was about 10 feet across from him. Two security personnel were positioned at the corridor entrance they had come in from, and Fred de Cordova was near the wall, to my left, with the expression of a man who has run out of available tools and is now witnessing rather than managing. Seagal said, all right. Show me. He said it with the quality of someone who has been saying certain things for an entire segment and is now ready to find out whether the things were accurate. Bruce said, you sure? Seagal said, yes. Bruce said, you sure? Again, same tone. The door offered a second time. Seagal said, I'm sure. Bruce looked at him for a moment, then he said, all right. Seagal moved. He moved the way someone with 6 years of serious Aikido training moves, with the forward commitment of a practitioner who has been drilling entry techniques for 6 years, and for whom the entry technique is the automatic first response to a real situation. He came toward Bruce with the reach and the step of a trained Aikido practitioner initiating contact. Bruce was not where the reach went. From the far wall near the road cases I watched it happen, and I want to describe what I saw as accurately as I can, which means acknowledging that accuracy about something this fast is limited. What I saw was Seagal committing to an entry. Seagal's entry arriving at a location that Bruce had recently vacated. Bruce in a location adjacent to where he had been. Contact made by Bruce's hands at Seagal's extending arm and shoulder. Seagal stumbled. His committed entry finding nothing to commit to, and his own momentum becoming the problem rather than the tool. He caught himself. He turned. His face was doing the thing that faces do when they receive information that the available categories don't fully account for. He came again. Different approach. The adjustment of someone who has processed what the first attempt found and is looking for a different variable. He came with more deliberate intent this time, the deliberate approach of someone who has decided not to commit fully until the entry is more certain. The result was the same. The difference was that with less full commitment, the result was more controlled. He didn't stumble. He found himself in a position he hadn't chosen, slightly off balance, and Bruce's follow-through contact was brief and precise and sent him to the rubber floor. He was down for 4 seconds, then he stood up, and if you think the two exchanges were the peak of what happened in that staging room, what Seagal did after he stood up from the floor will show you that you were still in the early part of the evening. He stood up with the quality of someone for whom being on the floor is a specific kind of information that requires a specific kind of response. Not anger exactly. Certainty. The certainty of someone who has decided that what just happened was the beginning of something, rather than the end of it. He came forward again. This time he abandoned the Aikido entry entirely. He came the way a person comes when technique hasn't worked and something more fundamental has taken over, with the forward determination of someone using mass and intent rather than system. He was 20 years old, and trained and large, and his intent was completely clear. Bruce moved inside it. What happened in the next 2 seconds is the specific thing I have tried to describe to 3 people over 50 years and have never fully succeeded at describing. The combination of what Bruce did with his left hand and then his right hand, and what the combination produced in terms of Seagal's weight and its relationship to the floor, was the most specific demonstration of a principle I had heard articulated many times and never seen at full speed until that moment. Seagal went to the floor again. This time harder than the first time. The rubber absorbed most of it, but the sound was real. He stayed there longer. Fred de Cordova said something. The security personnel had moved from the corridor entrance toward the center of the room. Bruce turned toward the corridor entrance. He was leaving. He had covered maybe 15 feet toward the door when Seagal stood up. He was up faster than I expected, 20 years old and trained, and the specific speed of a body that has decided it is not done, regardless of what the evidence of the previous 90 seconds suggests. He was on his feet and moving toward Bruce's back before the security personnel had completed their own movement toward him. He grabbed Bruce's right shoulder from behind. The grab was real. The grip of someone who has been building physical strength for 6 years and has applied it to a grab that is meant to hold something and turn it. Bruce turned inside the grip. I have thought about this specific moment more than almost any other moment from that evening. The turn was not away from the grab. It was toward it and through it. The turn that uses the grab's own commitment as the mechanism of its own undoing, and what followed the turn was a single, brief, controlled exchange that left Seagal on the floor for the 3rd time, this time against the wall. He was there for longer than either of the previous 2 times. 8 seconds, maybe 10. His hand on the wall, his chest heaving, his face doing the specific work of a person who has just run their available resources to their limit and is now conducting an inventory of what remains. The security personnel reached him. He looked at them, then at Bruce, who had not continued toward the corridor, but had stopped and turned when the grab happened and was now standing near the center of the room. Seagal said something to Bruce. I was close enough to hear it. He said, "How?" Not as a challenge. The question of someone who has received information and actually needs to understand it. Bruce said, "Your entries telegraph. I can see the decision before the body acts on it." Seagal said, "That's not possible at the speed I was moving." Bruce said, "You were on the floor 3 times. Seagal was quiet. He said, "I was moving fast." Bruce said, "You were moving at the speed your training built. I was reading your training. What your training tells me about where you're going happens before you get there." Seagal stood against the wall with the security personnel on either side of him, and he did something with this information. I could see him doing it. The face of someone who is taking a thing in rather than defending against it. He said, 6 years. Bruce said, "Yes." He said, "And it's visible that early." Bruce said, "Every system is visible if you know what to look for. The deeper the training, the more specific the pattern. The more specific the pattern, the earlier it appears." Seagal said, "That should make it harder to predict, not easier." Bruce said, "Most people think so." Fred de Cordova said, "From the wall. I need both of you to come back to the production area now. The audience has been held for 20 minutes. Neither of them moved immediately. Seagal was looking at Bruce with an expression that I could not fully categorize, not the expression he had come into that staging room with, which was the expression of a 20-year-old who had made a specific claim on national television and believed the claim. Something different. Something that had been produced by the previous 10 minutes and that didn't have a word I could find for it in the moment, though later I decided the word was recalibrated. He said, "I said something on that show." Bruce said, "Yes." He said, "I said it in front of a lot of people." Bruce said, "Yes." He said, "I was wrong." He said it simply, at the volume of a person saying something they mean, in a room where the only people who need to hear it are the people already in the room. Bruce said, "You said what you believed." Seagal said, "I believed it, without enough information." Bruce said, "That's a different thing from being wrong." Seagal said, "It produced the same result." Bruce said, "It produced tonight, which is not the result you expected." Seagal was quiet. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." Bruce said, "All right." He said, "Will you show me what you did? Not to use it against you, to understand it." Bruce looked at him for a moment. The specific way he looked at things that required the full attention. He said, "Come to Culver City, Tuesday morning. Come to work, not to see a demonstration." Seagal said, "I train 6 days a week." Bruce said, "Tuesday is available then." The security personnel were looking at Fred, who was looking at his watch. The audience had been held for 22 minutes. Bruce walked to the corridor door. At the door he stopped. He looked back at Seagal. He said, "The thing you said. You can't fight, you just act. That's worth thinking about." Seagal said, "I know it was wrong." Bruce said, "I'm not talking about whether it was wrong. I'm talking about why it was interesting. The gap between what the camera shows and what the training is, that's a real thing. You were pointing at a real thing with the wrong example. The real thing is worth thinking about." He went through the door. The segment that aired that night on the East Coast did not include the second commercial break or anything that came after it. The West Coast broadcast was edited to end after the first break. The production notes I saw later, during cleanup, described the segment as extended due to technical considerations and listed the edit as a scheduling decision. The audience that had been held for 22 minutes was released with an apology from the floor director and thanked for their patience. I went back to my monitoring position and sat there for a few minutes, doing nothing in particular. Bruce Lee died 8 months after that Thursday. He was 32 years old. I heard the news on the radio during my commute, and I pulled over and sat for a while. I thought about the staging room, about the 3 falls and the grab from behind and the exchange at the wall, about what Bruce said at the door before he went through it. The real thing is worth thinking about someone pointing at a real thing with the wrong example, and that being worth thinking about rather than worth dismissing. I am 85 years old. I have been in a lot of rooms over 85 years, and the secondary staging room at NBC Burbank in 1972 is the room I think about most. Not because of what happened physically, though what happened physically was extraordinary, because of what happened after. The 8 feet of silence between a 20-year-old on the floor and a 31-year-old near the door. The question how? The answer that began with your entry's telegraph and ended with Tuesday morning, and Bruce's face when he said the thing about the real thing being worth thinking about. The face of someone who is telling you something true about yourself and is doing it from a place of interest rather than victory. I was behind the set wall for the part that went on air. I was near the road cases for the part that didn't. This is the whole thing. All of it.